If you enjoy my videos, don't forget to like them, share them, and subscribe to my channel. And remember, small YouTube channels like this can't be monetized, so if you're able to support me by becoming a patron, it really helps. My Patreon link is in the description. I can't help but thinking as I've been going through this, getting ready to teach the Tuatha De Danann course about the Brythonic connections, which I probably won't be covering in that particular course. I'll probably be trying to stick to Ireland. But that immediately got me thinking about Lludd and Nuada and Lludd and Llefelys, which most people I think know are cognates. And I'm going to put something up on the screen later and we'll have a look at that, the names and the spellings and how we know they're cognates and stuff. But just take my word for it for the moment. And I don't know if everybody knows the story of Lludd and Llefelys, so I'm going to just kind of go over it briefly. Just a brief retelling of it. Lludd and Llefelys are two brothers. They're sons of the great ancestor deity, Beli-Mawr. And Lludd is king of Britain, ruling from London, which according to the story is named after him. Then the king of France dies, leaving only a daughter. So Llefelys, the younger brother, whom Lludd is very fond of, he goes off and marries this French king's daughter, and he becomes the new king of France. So we have these two brothers now ruling France and Britain. So after a few years, Britain is then plagued by these three strange oppressions. First, a race called the Cognate began to settle in great numbers, and there seems to be no way to attack them or drive them out because they have very acute hearing and they can hear any plans that are being made against them and know that they're being discussed. So how would you attack them? And then the second problem is that every May Eve, there's this terrible screaming sound that's heard all over the land, above every hearth, it says in the story. And it's so bad that women miscarry and warriors are enfeebled and people go mad and so on. And then finally, every time Lludd gives a feast, a week of feasting, he has all the food and drink prepared, everything goes well on the first day, but when they wake up on the second day, the huge provision of food and drinks all vanished. This leaves Lludd unable to continue his hospitality to his people, which of course is not a good thing. Now, Lludd is portrayed in the story as a really good guy, a good king, but Llefelys seems to be the clever one. So he goes to Llefelys for advice, and they meet in their ships somewhere off the coast of France, and they speak to one another through a special tube, a brass tube, so that the Cognate can't hear them. And Llefelys tells Lludd how to solve all these problems, long story short. And Lludd goes home and does as his brother suggests. So he takes some insects that Llefelys gave him, and he grinds them up, and he mixes them with water. Then he calls all the people together, both the Britons and the Cognate. He sprinkles everybody with this special liquid, and it proves absolutely harmless to the Britons, but it kills all the Cognate. They all die. So that's the first problem solved. And then next, on Llefelys' advice again, he has the island of Britain measured to find its exact center, which turns out to be at Oxford. So there a pit is dug and a great vat of mead placed in the pit, and Lludd has the whole thing covered with a sheet of silk. So May Eve arrives, and Lludd watches as the two great dragons rise up into the sky, fighting and screaming. The noise is almost unbearable, but after a while the dragons get tired and they fall out of the sky in the form of two little pigs onto the silken cloth. They fall into the vat of mead, and of course they begin greedily drinking it since they're little pigs until they both fall asleep. So as instructed, Lludd then bundles them up tightly in the cloth and has them buried in a stone vault atop Dinas Emrys. So no more screams are heard after that. And as long as they remained there, of course, they guarded the island from invaders. So finally, Lludd has a great lavish feast prepared for his people. So at the end of the first night, when everybody's growing tired, Lludd set himself to keep watch. Now, Llefelys had told him that a giant would come in the night to steal the food, and that this giant would put a powerful spell of sleep on everybody in the feasting hall. But Lludd had a vat of icy cold water prepared, and every time he felt himself getting sleepy, he took a dip in the cold water to keep himself awake. So finally, the giant appeared, and Lludd fought him and overcame him. And then he's at the point of killing the giant, and the giant begs for mercy on the condition that he will become Lludd's man after that, one of his warriors. So that's the 3 plagues of the island of Britain all finished. And that's the weird little story of Lludd and Llefelys finished too. So it might be hard to see much of a parallel between this and what we know of Nuada and Lugh as far as details are concerned. I don't think there is much, but if we look at the really big picture, there is a commonality. So both Lludd and Nuada find themselves in trouble within their own kingdom. They're plagued or oppressed by dark forces, if you will. In Nuada's case, the Fomorians are taxing and enslaving the Tuatha Dé Danann and showing blatant disregard for their culture, dishonoring their bards, ignoring rules of hospitality, and so on. Of course, it's Lugh who comes to the rescue. And although he comes with a destiny to kill the giant Balor, which is an act of war, an act of heroism, much of what Lugh does is based on his skills and on his dialogue with the different people of the Tuatha about what they can contribute to the battle against the Fomorians. So in both cases, the native king finds himself in a bit of trouble, and the help comes from a younger friend or brother who's kind of an outsider, Lugh or Llefelys. So as I promised, I'll show you these names and we'll talk about how they're cognates and so on. So in early Welsh orthography, that just means which letters represent which sounds. The sound represented by the English V might be represented by a V or a U in early Welsh. Now, in modern Welsh, of course, it's represented by the letter F. So the way the language has been written has undergone some changes. All of these names might have been pronounced Llefelys, in spite of the fact that this one's got a U in it. Although it's possible that if we go back a little further, maybe to Old Welsh or Common Brythonic or something like that, it may have been pronounced Llefelys or something like that, but it's difficult to know for sure. So when you know that, it perhaps helps you to see the cognate nature of the name. I think the relationship between Nuada and Nodens is easy enough to see. And there's also Neath, as in the father of Gwyn ap Nudd, who's also part of the same package. It seems like it was simply the Welsh love of alliteration which caused Neath, cognate with Nuada, to turn into Lludd. So it just sounded nice to have Lle or Llefelys or Llefelys and Lludd rather than Neath. And if that sounds crazy and far-fetched, we know they're cognate because he's sometimes called Lludd or Lludd Llaw Eraint, Lludd of the silver hand. And of course, Nuada Aragit Lav is Nuada of the silver arm or hand. And the story of how Nuada lost his arm in battle and had it replaced by a healer with an arm of silver, that's pretty well known, I think. There's no surviving lore about Lludd's arm, but there must have been a story at one time. Whether it was the same story or a different story, of course, we don't know. So Lludd is also mentioned in Cilach and Olwen. It's where we get another story about him relating to Callan Mai or May Day. This is the one where his daughter Craiddalad is almost carried off by a guy called Gwythyr. Before Gwythyr manages to sleep with her, Gwyn ap Nudd raises an army and takes her back in a very bloodthirsty way. Lots of blood and gore in a very short description. So finally, Arthur intervenes and puts a destiny on them. That's Gwyn ap Nudd and Gwythyr, to fight every May Eve until Judgment Day over this girl. Now, the usual understanding of this, I think most people, when they read it, is that Gwyn and Gwythyr are rivals for this girl's love. But if Nudd is Lludd, then that makes Craiddalad and Gwyn brother and sister. So you might interpret it as Gwyn going to defend his sister's honor, to get his stolen sister back. That's not a rabbit hole we're going to go down today. So when we look at some of Nuada's stories, and also could consider who else in Irish lore might be acting as his double, there are a number of angles to all this, but still maybe something of a common theme. So I'm going to kind of leave Lugh and his cognates behind at this stage and talk a bit more about these different Nuadas or Lludd's. So first of all, in the middle here, we've got Nechtyn. And this seems to be where it all starts in Irish lore. If we try and put the mythology in a kind of chronological order as it appears to happen. It's not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily make it the oldest story. So first of all, this Nechtyn, he's supposed to be the god of the spring where the river Boyne rises. And although that name begins with N, it's not cognate with Nuada in the sense it's got a different root and a different meaning. So just because it begins with M doesn't mean it's a cognate in that sense. But as a character, he's quite cognate. So the spring is the famous well with the hazel trees and the salmon of knowledge and all that. And this Nechtyn was married to one called Buan or Boan. So Boan was forbidden from looking at this well that contained the salmon of knowledge. But of course, if you're forbidden to do something in a myth, you do it. So she did. And this caused a flood to burst forth from the well. And this is what created the river Boyne. So there are stories that happen later where Boan is married either to a guy called Elkvar. Obviously, that name is not cognate with Nuada, but sometimes he's called Nuada. So we get the same story about Elkvar and about Nuada. He's now married to Boan, and they live at the Brúna Boyne, that is at New Greenwich. The Dagda comes along. He wants to have sex with Boan. So he plays a trick on this Elkvar Nuada character, makes the sun stand still for 9 months. So he has time to have sex with Boan and for her to gestate and give birth to Oengus. So that's how Oengus comes into being. And then later, in other stories, either Oengus or the Dagda trick Elkvar out of the Brug and take it for themselves. And then finally, there's a story of Fionn Machul and the Salmon of Knowledge, in which his teacher Finnegas has been trying to catch this salmon. And of course, when he catches it, in a story not unlike the story of Taliesin and Ceridwen, Fian gets some salmon juice on his finger, it burns, he licks it, bang, he's got the knowledge. So this Phineagus is sometimes called Nuada Phineagus in some texts. So what's going on here? It's really hard to say for sure. There's a trend in that all these Nuada cognates, except for Nodens, who has no mythology left, in some way they're weak or they're in trouble. They're getting a little older. Nuada is beset by troubles. Nuada has his arm cut off and he loses his kingship. Then his arm's repaired and he regains his kingship. But he doesn't seem to be capable of much action after that. He's kind of stuck in this loop with the bad Fomorians. Elkvar is repeatedly tricked. The Dagda sleeps with his wife and then he loses his fortress. Phineagus catches the salmon only to end up handing it over to Fian. And I'm afraid I don't have massive conclusions about all this, but I just think it's interesting. I've been thinking about this for a few years since a course I taught a long time ago where we talked about this, and again didn't really reach any conclusions. So I thought, well, it's time to bring it up again and call it to your attention if you're not aware of all the weirdness.